Act Utilitarianism, from Chapter 6, Parts 4 and 5. Act Utilitarianism treats all individuals impartially, counting every individual exactly the same. It also focuses on specific situations. The situation determines what choices of action there are, along with the likely effects of each choice. This means that Act Utilitarianism can only be applied to particular situations, as what can and should be done both depends on the situation's circumstances. Finally, utilitarianism considers the right act to be the one that produces the greatest overall utility. Act Utilitarianism is intended to explain right and wrong, or to answer the question, what makes an act morally right? Act Utilitarianism's answer is that it's right to distribute the most utility we can overall to those individuals affected by an act. Achieving the greatest overall utility is what makes an act right. That act being the right act is an objective fact, since it depends solely on what generates the most overall utility in that situation. Opinions, desires, and even ignorance make no difference to what's right. So, to define Act Utilitarianism, the morally right act is the act that results in producing the greatest overall utility. So, if we're trying to answer the question, what's right? The morally right act is the act that results in producing the greatest overall utility. But how should we understand this concept of utility here? Our book understands utility in a very general way, as encompassing good or desirable consequences. So, this means that producing the greatest overall utility is to produce the most good or desirable consequences. However, utility is also often understood in terms of pleasure and pain. If we are going to redefine Act Utilitarianism using pleasure and pain, we might do it kind of like this. Act Utilitarianism says that the morally right act is the act that results in producing the greatest overall pleasure or avoiding the greatest overall pain. Now, as we may have discovered, Act Utilitarianism requires us to do this thing called a hedonistic calculus. Now, we might wonder what exactly it is that we measure to figure this out. So there are a variety of different systems that we can use, but the one that our book chooses is to consider 4 aspects. So we might consider the scope. So we might ask, which individuals will be affected? How many? The greatest number affected by an act, the greater the scope of its effects. The greater the scope, the more the act influences overall utility. Duration. How long will each effect last? Some effects are short-lived. Others continue a long time. The longer the effect lasts, the more it influences overall utility. Intensity. Experiences can differ in their degrees of strength or force. Some desirable effects, as well as some other kinds of suffering, can be intense, and others are fairly mild. Effects can also vary in intensity from one person to another. Probability. We don't know how the future will be, so we don't know for certain what effects any particular action will produce. The best an Act Utilitarian can do, therefore, is to estimate the chances of each possible effect. These estimates should then be used to assign weights to each effect, whether they're desirable or not. Now, Act Utilitarianism has a variety of attractions. One attraction of this type of utilitarianism is its objectivity. Each particular situation involves a set of definite facts, what the choices are, what the effects each choice would bring about, and what amount of utility or disutility each effect would produce. Based on these facts, the right choice, that which would produce the greatest utility, or the least overall disutility, if no choice will produce positive overall utility, is an objective matter of fact. Another attraction, because Act Utilitarianism was originally intended to help reform the British criminal justice system, is that Act Utilitarianism is also impartial. Since it only considers the effects of an act, it can't be influenced by who the actor is, whether high or low born, statesman, criminal, male, female, or anywhere else on the gender spectrum. All individuals are counted within the scope as equals. A third attraction is that Act Utilitarianism is extremely simple. It explains all morality by a single principle. This principle, furthermore, is highly intuitive in at least two ways. First, Act Utilitarianism is surely on the right track in treating an act's consequences as morally significant. And second, it resonates with human psychology, since we all seek desirable experiences while we try to avoid experiences that we find undesirable. Act Utilitarianism is also very flexible. Although it defines right acts by a single principle, the utility for any act depends on each situation's particular circumstances. Since these can vary, there's considerable leeway in the moral judgments Act Utilitarianism makes. The results can be surprising. For instance, while Act Utilitarianism might require telling the truth in one situation, it might forbid it in another. This sensitivity to circumstance is seen as a major advantage by many people, and actually, as we'll see, it may also be seen as a disadvantage. Finally, many see utilitarianism as attractive because it so easily extends to include non-humans. Since many animals have both positive and negative conscious experiences, it seems unwarranted to neglect them in utilitarianism considerations. Thus, the utilitarian evaluation of any situation involving animals usually includes them among the individuals within its scope. Now, there is also a number of problems with Act Utilitarianism. But remember that, as we saw in the introduction, when we're considering problems, this doesn't immediately mean that the theory is no good. For each problem, there's a response to the problem. One problem is all of this calculating. How accurately can we determine the scope, intensity, and duration of several actions, consequences, as well as accurately estimate the probabilities of each? Another problem is the moral saints problem. A cluster of problems arises from the extensive moral demands an Act Utilitarianism places on us. First, the theory turns everything into a moral issue. What I mean by this is that because everything involves utility in some way, that means that there's a right or a wrong for every single action. So, what shirt we pick out when we go to the store to go clothes shopping suddenly becomes a moral issue, according to Act Utilitarianism. Next, utilitarianism tells us that for any situation, there's always some best choice. This entails that I ought to reject all alternatives in favor of that best choice. Choosing anything less amounts to my failing to act morally. Another problem has to do with promises, justice, and rights. Act Utilitarianism often supports our moral intuitions that lying, murder, breaking contracts, and cheating are wrong. Yet, there can be situations where even those wrongs could produce the greatest utility, making them right instead. For instance, as executioner of his estate, I promised a dying man to pay $20,000 debt he incurred 40 years ago. This debt's owed to one of the richest men on earth, who's long since forgotten about it. Should I pay the debt? The money would do much greater good invested in cancer research or given to the local soup kitchen. Also, the dead man can't be affected by what I do, and no one else witnessed my promise. Thus, my breaking this particular promise would likely produce more utility than my keeping it. But would it be right to break the promise? All right, to review. Act Utilitarianism says that the morally right act is the act that results in producing the greatest overall utility. So, we can answer the question, what act is right, by asking ourselves, what act produces the greatest overall utility? What are some reasons that we might be attracted to Act Utilitarianism? And what are some problems with Act Utilitarianism?